Okay, gang, let's finish up what we started yesterday, talking in section 2.1. A lot of it's just vocabulary type stuff. We didn't define opposites yesterday. Okay? You guys have an intuitive sense of what it means to be opposite. What's the opposite of 3? Negative 3. What's the opposite of negative 5?
Positive 5.
Positive 5. So if you think about a number line, okay, if you think about a number line, it's my attempt at a number line. Here's 0. 1, 2, what's the opposite of 3?
Negative 3.
Now, what can you tell me about both of their distances from 0? Kendra?
They're both 3 away from 0.
They're both 3 away from 0. So one way to define opposites are two numbers that are the same distance from 0.
Wait, we read those in our notes from yesterday?
We didn't write these yesterday. We didn't fill in all of the definitions yesterday. So we're still in section 2.1. What is it, about the third or fourth definition, I think? Fourth, okay. So opposite, just two numbers on the same distance from 0, like 3 and negative 3. Okay, now before we go to absolute value, one way that we can think about opposite is we can think about it like the negative symbol. Okay, think of negative symbol like opposite. I mean, here's 3. Negative 3 is just like the opposite of positive 3. So seeing that negative symbol is really just like saying find the opposite of something. All right, then we got absolute value. Somebody tell me what they've done absolute value before. In fact, this was one of our MCA terms, I think, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tipka.
The number away from 0, or the number that in numbers away from 0.
Yeah, pretty close. Julia? The absolute value of negative 3 is positive 3, yeah. Is absolute value going to be positive, negative, sometimes always positive? Think of it like a distance, right? We did the example last couple weeks ago. We said, you know, how far away from the movie theater do you live? And no one said, I live negative 3 miles from the movie theater. You never say I live negative some miles away. We don't think of distance as a negative. Okay, so absolute value, a number's distance from 0, it's always going to be positive. And what do these two vertical bars mean?
What's the absolute value symbol?
That's the absolute value symbol. Two vertical bars surrounding a number, that's our absolute value symbol. So the absolute value of 4, well, 4 is 4 away from 0. Absolute value of negative 6, well, how far away from 0 is negative 6? It's 6 away. Okay, and then our last vocab word today comes up in science class quite a bit. It's called a conditional statement. And it's any statement that has a hypothesis. That's a fancy word for the if part of a conditional statement. And it's got a conclusion. That's the then part of a statement. Okay, well, you guys write those down. I'm gonna write a conditional statement, and you can decide if you agree with it or not. One more here. I'm just gonna. No, you don't have to write these down. I'm just using them as examples here. Okay, so here's a couple examples of conditional statements. Look at the red one first. It says, if you're in Mr. Hilliard's class, then you're at McGuire. Does it have an if part?
Yes.
What's the hypothesis in that red statement? What's the hype?
If you're in Mr. H's class.
Yeah, the if part. You're in Mr. Hilliard's class. What's the conclusion?
Well, the conclusions in your MMS, but aren't you like a teacher at South for sports? Can you be in like your track class?
Well, let's say you're in Mr. Hilliard's, this is my classroom. If you're in this classroom right now, are you at McGuire? Yeah, so some statements are true. But now take the top red line and splice in the blue line. If you're in Mr. Hilliard's class, then you're a boy.
No.
True or false? Kian?
False.
False. Sometimes conditional statements are false. Now, when they're false, we have to be able to provide a counter example. One example that proves something false. Can you give me a counter example? Tyshana's in here, right? Tyshana is in Mr. Hilliard's class. She's not a boy. Boom, there we go. She's a counter example to that statement. All right, here we go. Take a look, jump all the way to example 4. First, we're dealing with opposites. Again, if you didn't already write it in your notes, think of the negative symbol being like opposite. If A is negative 4.8, then what's negative A? Or another way to think about it, the negative symbol's like saying? Opposite. What's the opposite of A? What's the opposite of this? Yeah, it's like saying, what's the opposite of negative 4.8? And anytime you see two negatives next to each other, what do you got to do? Got to protect yourself. Negative, negative. Chop, chop. Did you guys ever work on chopping last year?
Yeah. A little bit.
Grace, did you protect yourself? Negative, negative. Oh, I just chopped you up. Negative, negative. Oh my gosh. Did that teach you anything in 7th grade? Negative, negative. Oh, good, but I got you at the second chop. You can't just chop one of them. You can't just do this. You got to chop them both. Negative, negative. Yeah. Huh? Did you see that? I'm scaring Tipka. Negative, negative. Oh my.
So I was
Chop.
a little slow in the reaction.
A little? A little? You were like that alligator that you ate at the state fair. Okay, we chopped two negatives, so the opposite of negative 4.8 is positive 4.8. How about if A is 5/6, what's negative A? What's the opposite of 5/6? Negative 5/6, good. Okay, very good. All right, now we talk absolute value. We've got all these fancy definitions for absolute value. I just like to use numeric examples. What's the absolute value of 5?
5.
It's 5 away from 0. What's the absolute value of 0?
0.
It's 0 away from 0. What's the absolute negative 4?
4.
Yeah, it's 4. Okay. They like to make you think of it's the opposite of negative 4, but I think that's going into it a little too much. We just think of it as distance from 0, we're going to be good to go. Okay, let's find some absolute values. Jump to example 5 here. If A is negative 3/7, what's the absolute value of that? So what's the absolute value of negative 3/7?
3/7.
Riley?
Is it 3/7?
Yeah, it's distance from 0. It's 3/7 away from 0. If A is 2.9, what's the absolute value of 2.9?
2.9.
You guys got it. 2.9 is distance from 0. Okay? All right, jump to example 6. We're cruising pretty fast today. Jump to example 6. Identify the hypothesis and conclusion of this statement. If a number is an integer, then the number is positive. Let's start with just identifying the hypothesis and the conclusion. Who thinks they can tell me what the hypothesis is? Remember, that's just a fancy word for the if part. What do you got, Julia?
If a number is an integer.
Okay, so a number is an integer. The if part. A number is an integer. Who's got the conclusion? Riley.
Then the number is positive.
Yeah, it's the then part. So the number is positive. Okay, now we have to decide. Tell whether the statement is true or false, and if it's false, give a counter example. Okay? Is this a true statement or a false statement? If a number is an integer, remember that's like the numbers on the number line back there. If a number is an integer, is it automatically positive? Doll, what do you think? Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you're stretching, huh? I thought you were raising your hand. Well, what do you think? If a number is an integer, is it automatically positive?
No, because the integer will be negative.
There you go. Okay, so this is a false statement. Now you're right, an integer can be negative, but somebody give me a counter example, one specific number that is an integer, but it's not positive. Give me one specific example. Can you give me one, doll? Okay, see ya. -3 is a counter example. One specific case that proves it false. Now hide, you want to show your face in the camera? I'm just kidding, you could. Oh, hooked. Oh, I'm still hooked. Yeah.
What if you just wrote false because -3 is
You could write false because -3. You could write false because -3 is not positive. I was just saying that it's false, and then -3 is one specific counterexample. How many counterexamples could you come up with in this case?
100 gazillion.
100 gazillion
Infinity.
and beyond. To infinity and beyond. There's an infinite number of counterexamples for this one. All right. Why don't you guys try number 2, 3, and 4 real quick when you think you've got them. Raise your hand. You're supposed to find -a, so you're supposed to find the opposite of a, and you're supposed to find the absolute value. Make sure you find both. First one, number 2. Now, one thing I noticed, a lot of people didn't label their answers. A lot of people just put 2 numbers, and it's hard to tell which answer is which unless you label them. So, good habit to get into here is if we're supposed to find the opposite of a, let's just write the opposite of a. So, what's the opposite of 6? -6. And then the absolute value of a, so the absolute value of 6 would be?
6.
Very good. We plug in -9.5. So, what's the opposite of a?
9.5.
Good. The opposite of a negative is going to be positive. Come on. Oh, come on. It disconnected. There we go. Maybe not. Nye, what'd you do to my board? Jeez. So the opposite is a positive 9.5. And the absolute value of a? How far away from 0 is -9.5? 9.5. What's the opposite of -3/8? Positive 3/8. And then how far away is -3/8 from 0? 3/8. Very good. Okay, last slide for today. I want you guys to try this checkpoint problem. I want you to try to identify the hypothesis, the if part, the conclusion, the then part, and then I want you to decide if the statement is true or false. Okay, the hypothesis, that's the if part. Somebody help me out. What do you got for the hypothesis? Who hasn't helped yet today? Julia's been carrying us, Stuart's been carrying us, Kaden's been helping out. Kendra, what do you got? What's the hypothesis?
I was saying if the number is negative.
Okay, a number is negative. That's the if part. It's the hypothesis. What's the conclusion in this statement?
Go Caitlin.
Somebody else help her out. That's all right. Who hasn't helped us yet today? Fish. Good, the then part. So absolute value is negative. Okay. How many people think that's true? How many think it's false? Based on the votes, I'd have to say it's false, but if you think it's false, you have to be able to provide a counterexample. One specific number that is negative, but that's absolute value is not negative. Taishana.
The absolute value of -6 is 6.
-6. It's a negative integer. It's a negative number, but the absolute value of -6, it's not negative, it's positive. Very good. Okay. You guys have the tools you need? All right. Quite a bit of work time today.